Hello, church. It has been many miles and a few weeks since I've been with you. Thank you for all of your prayers and all your prayers out there. Most of you know I was in Tanzania the last 2 weeks, here via pre-recording because we never want to let you down, but elsewhere, and I still have half the dust of Africa in my lungs, throat, and sinuses, so bear with me as I attempt to readjust to American time. But thank you, Epaphras has already signed in this morning. Thank you, Epaphras, for driving me, keeping me alive in that traffic, and then also taking me and introducing me to, I don't really remember how many churches it eventually turned out to be. We went back to some of them 2 times, but I'm going to say 7, 8 churches at least, and had a wonderful experience getting to know the people. I will probably do a video and ask John Knutson and Dave to help put together slides and videos behind it, just to kind of let you know how the trip went, my impressions and the like. But that's not today. Today, this is Sunday. So as much as I want every day to be about me, this isn't about me at all. This is about Jesus. Today begins a series of 6 sermons to lead us up to Palm Sunday and then, of course, to Easter. We are giving titles to each of these 6 sermons that come from popular movies, books, poems, or the like, just to make them easier to remember. And the one this morning is called Courage Under Fire, which was not a major film, but it was a pretty big film with Denzel Washington, my favorite actor, and Meg Ryan, and it was about a 1996 film about investigation into the actions of an Army pilot, Meg Ryan, under fire. Courage Under Fire seems to be the right name for what we're going to talk about today. Whenever we take this march, we are a people getting ready to acknowledge our King as the risen Lord. And yet, we don't always get to acknowledge that King in a safe place. Easter's coming. Easter's the biggest holiday in the Christian calendar. The reason that Christmas seems bigger is because it's also a secular holiday. So it has a lot more commercials, a lot more sales, a lot more cards, and a lot more things. But Easter is, without question, the largest, most important date in the Christian calendar. Easter stands alone. And standing alone is the subject of today's lesson. I have often talked about the struggles between me and my father. My father nobody's a cartoon. Nobody's all bad, all good. Everybody's a mix. And my father taught me many valuable lessons, but the most important lesson my father taught me was the ability to stand alone. Regardless of what anyone else is doing, stand alone. Now that may sound to some of you as a very simple thing. It was not to me. It took a lot of study and work and practice. And I haven't perfected it, but I'm pretty good at it. How do you find the courage, though, to stand alone against impossible odds when it seems the whole world is out to get you? And you're not being paranoid. It just seems that every structure in the world is there to bring you down. I know that sounds overdramatic, but let's just deal with some facts that we don't often talk about. It should not be a surprise, but it may be to you to know that by every survey done in the last 6 years, everyone I could find, Christians are no longer the majority in the United States. And in fact, we are shrinking. Faith in God actually is ticked up a little bit, but that includes gods of Islam, gods of other religions, and nebulous, I just believe there's a thing out there, people. When it comes to Christians, we have dropped well below the 50% mark. We're actually lagging on the curve there. In Europe, it is a very tiny minority who believe in Christ. In Scotland and the United Kingdom as a whole, you're talking around 25% is a really optimistic number. Most people put it closer to 15%. In Europe, Christianity seems to be vanishing. Many of us are old enough to remember a world where you just assumed the person you were talking to believed in God. You assumed they were a member of a church. You assumed they had Christian principles as a norm, at least. Some of us are even old enough to remember public service announcements that would pop on, especially on a Saturday evening, that would remind us to go to the church of your choice. Do you remember those? I do, because my father would always get angry and say, you should go to the church of God's choice, which was handily enough ours. But even on the airways, go to the church of your choice. Over the last 40 years, that has changed. In fact, my wife and I watch television. We have shows that we like. Most of them are actually from Breton. We subscribe to a streaming service so we can watch those. For many years, if you watch a British crime drama, if you find someone who is religious in the characters, or someone who has a Bible, they will be the bad person every time. They will be the psychopath, the sociopath, the killer. They will be the horrible, judgmental person that every time, the hypocrite. It is now more and more that way in America. In fact, we've noticed that the majority of times in America, when you find a Christian and they bring up they're a Christian or they're a preacher or they're involved, they're the bad guy. Watch. Have you not noticed? You should notice these things. The culture is trying to bend us that way. The Gospel Coalition quoted Tim Keller as saying this, quote, "We are entering a new era in which there is not only no social benefit to being Christian, but an actual social cost. In many places, culture is becoming increasingly hostile toward faith and belief in God, truth, sin, and the afterlife are all disappearing, and more people. Now culture is producing people for whom Christianity is not only offensive, but incomprehensible." Does that sound like he's overstating it? If it sounds like he's overstating it, let me suggest to you that you have been living in a church bubble, because I see the hostility to Christianity. I see it whenever there are marches celebrating the killing of the unborn, and where it is perfectly acceptable for someone on television to say, I support the killing of the unborn. It is a culture that has fallen into a culture of death, whenever it is entirely acceptable to many to take healthy body parts off of healthy children and call it health care. There's a problem in our society, because not only are these people not shamed and driven from the public forum, they make millions. They become powerful. They become government officials or NGO officials. This is a very sick world, and it is very hostile to Christianity. My wife and I were actually in Scotland on a visit in 1994 when the LA earthquake hit. That was so tragic. And as I just remember that, and we're not going to talk about the earthquake, 1994. So we're talking 30 years ago. And I asked her to notice every day in the newspaper, there would be articles attacking Christians, churches, or faith. And every day on the news, they would find a way to attack Christians and faith. And that was 30 years ago. It's becoming more common now. If you ask the average person now, because we're not the majority anymore, what they think of Christians, you will hear judgmental, silly, or they're still here. We need to deal with the facts of where we are. Remember the hymn that said, "This world is not my home, I'm just a passing through. My treasures are laid up somewhere beyond the blue." For many of us, these words finally ring true. After a lifetime of living well and being the majority and having the support of our culture, we find ourselves stranded and sometimes under direct attack for merely believing. The truth is, we've always been strangers here, we just forgot. We got distracted with all of our playthings. We got distracted with our pretty buildings and with our hymns and with our screens and with our worship teams. And we found ourselves entranced by our homes and our cars and the culture. And social media, and we got to be, as Don Henley said of the Eagles, prisoners of our own device, carrying it around in our own hands and letting the culture tell us when to be outraged, when to be happy, what is funny, who is owning liberals or conservatives, and we got all wrapped up in it. We've always been strangers here, we just forgot. Now we find ourselves to be outsiders, and we're not comfortable with that. And too many Christians then react by becoming dispirited, defensive, or angry about this. And books are written about how to take a third way, or the Benedict's way, or this way, how to survive through this culture. I've not read all the books, so I'm not going to try to judge them in part or as a whole. But rather, for much of the next 6 weeks, we're going to be dipping into the Bible that Jesus read, what we call the Old Testament, what is more properly called the Hebrew Scriptures. The Jews, when you read that, you got to know the Old Testament. You really do. I know there's a lot in there that's troubling, a lot in there that seems to clash with the nature of God and Christ. But the stories there, we're going to unfold, especially in the last few weeks of this series, how these things are intertextual, how they work with other texts throughout the Scripture. And in the New Testament, it is assumed you know the Old. This is one thing I will bring up about my trip into Tanzania. I found out on day one, whenever I stood up and talked to them and said, I'm from Nashville, Tennessee, the interpreter froze, didn't know what those words meant. And I said, that's just the name of a city. And we were able to get that. And then I looked and realized they have that brings no pictures to their head at all. Not Nashville, not Tennessee. Now, those of us who live in Tennessee are very offended by that because we are the center of the universe, just like you are where you live, right? But I said, if you ask anybody in Western Europe or in the Americas, Canada down through Central America, if you ask them, what is Nashville, they will bring up, and I brought up, Music City, and it's a green city, it's a beautiful climate, this, that, and the other. I said, the problem is when I say that, none of those pictures come in your head. And I took that and decided, I'm just going to tell about Jesus stories. And I said, when you read Jesus stories, unless you know the background, the culture, the history, you don't understand the Jesus stories. And so we began to take them apart. And that's all I did for 2 weeks, was to take apart the Jesus stories and say, here's the history behind it. You've got to know your Old Testament before you're able to survive a world like today, because the Old Testament was in a world like today. The Jews were always a minority. They were always under attack. They were always in danger of annihilation, and yet they kept their faith over the centuries. I know some of you reflexively will say, the Old Testament is full of them not keeping their faith. Absolutely, just like us, but they got it back. And as a culture, they held on to it. How did they do that? Well, we're going to start with a story that we all know, we think. The story of Daniel and his friends. Daniel and his friends had lived a blessed life in Judah. Where they were, things were going well. The economy was good. People had comforts they had not had for a long time. There was security, personal security, and national security. You could go about your entire day doing well, eating well, and not feeling under threat. And then Babylon came. Before then, they were raised in a community of faith that supported their involvement in all levels of society. Nobody left out. And then that all ended in a heartbeat. And they were taken away to Babylon, where they would spend the rest of their lives. The words used to describe Daniel would indicate he was no older than 15 and perhaps as young as 12 when he was taken. He would live into his late 80s, some say early 90s, as an exile, stranded in a hostile land, never returning home, never returning to the order, the religion, the faith, the community, the culture that he'd known. I think we have a lot to learn from Daniel. We have also been on an exodus out of the majority and comfort into a new place here where it is only going to get rougher. where people will use Christ and use the Bible, but they will use it to support the progressive left or Christian nationalism. They won't use it to support Christ, who does not fit in any box and will never be seen on the ballot box. When I was a boy, we had frequent lessons about Daniel, but they were always about dare to be a Daniel. Our church was opposed to dancing, but I was taken to school sometimes where part of the physical ed was to teach some sort of dancing. They called it square dancing, I think, at one school I was in, but they didn't seem to be moving in perfect squares, and so I wasn't sure what that meant. But I had to have a note to go in hand that I was to sit off to the side because we don't dance, we don't approve of dancing. Well, that made me the odd guy, but they would use these illustrations, you just dare to be a Daniel. Reading the story of Daniel, it seems like he might have gone through a lot more than that. I want to say the way through a storm is not to be a Daniel. The way to survive a storm is to believe in Daniel's God. It's very different. I don't want us to be like Daniel. I want us to have the faith in Daniel's God, because that's what got them through. By the way, there is a lovely little book published, I think, a year ago, maybe two now, by a Scotsman, so it's going to be good, Alistair Begg. And Begg is B-E-G-G. Sounds like you're saying a K, but that's just the way we say it. Alistair Begg. And it is called Brave by Faith. And it's about this story. It's a small book. You might enjoy that. Moving on. If we're reading the story of Daniel correctly, we're not going to see Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah as heroes. Does that surprise you? If we're reading it correctly, the hero of the story is God. They would not want us to look upon them as heroes. They want you to look at God as the hero of the story. If you are in troubled times, and you are, whether you realize it or not, the first step you must do is draw your lines. Determine where you will go and where you will not, what you will say and what you will not, when you will comply and when you will not comply. Draw your lines. We're going to talk a lot about that in the next few days, next few weeks, because to prepare for a risen Lord, we'd better have some lines already drawn. Jerusalem fell to the mighty Babylonian Empire, a brutal empire. I will not go into the brutalities at this stage. The king, the royal family, and the elite of society, the intelligentsia, royal families, that type of thing, those people, the academics, and as well as the really skilled craftsmen and laborers, those were the people who were taken and marched away. The temple was destroyed. The very house of God was destroyed. Can you imagine? This was where you met God. It was the only acceptable place on the planet to meet God. It was the only place you could do a sacrifice for your sins. It was the only place, it was the pin that held the entire faith together. It is gone. And now, somewhere between 20 and 30% of your population has been taken away. We're not going to talk about the ones left behind at this stage. In the future, I think we should. We're going to talk about those who are ripped away from it all. What do you do? What do you do when everything you had is gone? Every cultural support is now gone. Were the gods of Babylon greater and stronger than the God of Israel? Where is God in this? We would ask those questions. I think those are fair questions. We would wonder if our faith in the goodness of God had been in vain. If you've never, ever had those kind of doubts, you've lived a blessed, charmed life. And it is not because you have such great faith. It is because God hadn't let some things happen to you. Because if he had, you would have asked, is God good? Where is God when it hurts? How strong is God? It is a good idea to remember that when we sing songs about the sweetness and goodness of God and how he is showering us with blessings, that at that very moment there's someone in tremendous pain and wondering where God is or even if he is. Remember that this world truly is not our home, and it's a tough, tough road. Parents at that time would have despaired for their children. How can they hold to the faith of their fathers, which is the only thing which held the Jews together? When the temple is gone and they're removed to a land that does not honor God, and instead this land bows down to false gods and insists at the point of a sword that you do it too. How will we keep our children? How serious was this? When the 10 northern tribes were taken into Assyrian captivity, they were eventually assimilated and lost. They never kept the faith. They never kept their culture. It disappeared. And to this day, gone. Our own society looks more like Babylon than Jerusalem, and it has for generations. Let's just admit it. It's just getting easier, I think, to admit it now, but this is not an anti-American screed, for the same can be said about almost anywhere on earth. The world is much better. Please understand this. The world is much better at evangelizing our children than we are. The world has more money, more power, more media, more access, and more might than we have. Daniel and his friends would have been forgiven for going underground with their faith, pausing it a bit, going along on the outside while doing what our Catholic friends call mental reservation, keeping their faith in God somewhere in their hearts. But they didn't do that. Even when the re-education of the captives began, they kept on believing. How deep did the re-education go? Oh, they didn't just change their pronouns, they changed their names. Daniel is a name that means God is my judge. His new name was Belteshazzar, Prince of Baal. Remember Baal? His real name in the book of Daniel, it's even spelled B-E-L, Bel. But I did not know until a few years ago when I was listening to a podcast with a panel of Hebrew experts, rabbis, and Syriac and Chaldean experts, and they all pronounced it Baal. I don't want to keep saying Baal because it seems pretentious, but that was his name. He was taken away from his God and said, you are now prince of that God. Hananiah's name meant Yahweh has shown grace. It was changed to Shadrach, the command of Aku. Aku was a moon god. So now, instead of God's grace, I belong to the moon god. Mishael's name meant who is like God. His name was changed to Meshach, who is as great as Aku. Azariah's name meant God has helped me. It was changed to Abednego, the servant of Nebo, or Nico, or Nego rather. Nico or Nego in some, it varies according to which manuscript. Another god. In other words, they were now told the only name they answered to was the name of their new god. These 4 captives are just representatives of the thousands upon thousands taken into captivity, and through them we see what life was like for all of the captives. Taken into captivity, the name of God taken from them, the name of pagan deities given to them, they were then placed into an intensive, listen carefully, re-education program. They had to learn the literature and the language of the Chaldeans, the Babylonians. Every powerful state insists on educating its children to have its worldview, its definition of right and wrong. We've found in America that we've come to the point where parents can scrimp and save to send their children to spend a fortune learning that their parents are evil and ignorant and the culture is evil. Why would we pay somebody to teach them this? I think some people are waking up, but the fact is, what Babylon did is what governments do. Re-educated, relocated, renamed, but their culture was not done with them yet. They would also have to learn to eat and drink what the king ate and drank. You got to act like us, like what we like, and run with us. And they said, no. They had drawn a line. Now stop here for a moment and ask yourself where your lines are, and have you drawn them in stone or in sand? When Martin Luther was hauled before the religious court, the Diet of Worms, which diet means court and worms or worms, it was a city. So Diet of Worms always sounded really gross, but just means a religious court. He was hauled and threatened with excommunication, or worse, if he did not recant his faith in Scripture alone and faith alone. He said words to the effect of, "Here I stand, I can do no other, so help me God." He was willing to face disenfranchisement or death rather than crossing a line he had drawn. Do you have lines? Where are they? Daniel and his friends drew this line because they had strict dietary laws that were part of their faith. They had no power to stop their being renamed. They had no power to stop them being relocated. But they would not participate in directly disobeying the rules of what is proper to eat and drink. This wasn't a diet. This was an outside sign of obedience to Yahweh, a revelation of where their lines were drawn. Now, important here, they didn't become jerks. Daniel was never a thorn in his captor's side. He let them know he was willing to learn and do as much as his faith allowed, but no more. Daniel chapter 1, verse 9. When his captors and educators came up against a line he'd already drawn, he would stop and say, "No further." And this is not the only time they would come up to that line. We'll find out in the next 2 weeks. But here's the secret about lines. You've got to draw them before the crisis. You've got to decide who you are, where you will stand, where you will not move from. And I know that's ending with a preposition. What is it about you and your faith that you say, "No more, here I stand, so help me God"? Those lines have to be done now. A few weeks ago, I posted on my social media a set of very simple sentences. This is what I wrote. "These are not my lines. I did not draw them. I refuse to color within them, for I have another picture in mind." Who has drawn the lines and told you to color the picture of who you are and who other people are? Who African Americans are, who white people are, who left people are, who right people are? Who told you what to think about these people? Who told you what your value was? Who told you about life, meaning, and purpose? Sometimes it's important to remember that only a dead fish swims with the current. A live fish swims against it. Our faith must be alive regardless of what culture says or does. Daniel does not harangue his chief educator. He asks for time to prove that the way of God is true and right. Says, "Give us an experiment. If it doesn't work, then we will do what you told us to do." A little side note here. A lot of people have gone to Daniel chapter 1, verses 9 through 16, and tried to come up with what they call the Daniel diet. And there are seminars and books and such on it. This is not a Daniel diet. This is just them following God's law, and it's his miracle. So again, don't try to take God out as the hero of the story and make it what you eat. No. These people kept their faith because, here's important, they believed God was still in their story, even in the painful and terrible parts of the story. We haven't even discussed that they castrated these boys. They made them eunuchs long before there was any anesthesia, antibiotics. These boys went through horrendous pain and were emasculated, but they believed God was still in their story. Look in chapter 1 alone. In verses 2, verses 9, and verses 17, all of them show God did this. God was in control. He did not stay behind in Jerusalem. He did not leave the world because his house was destroyed. And he has not left us either. Well, I believe we need to deal with our reality. I believe that the worst possible response to it would be either apathy or despair. It is prepare. Prepare for the reality you're in. God has not left us whether we live in Tanzania, Singapore, Spain, Ireland, or America. There's a meme. We're going to wrap this story up here in a few minutes. There is a meme that shows up in movies so often that it's considered a cliche now, something to be avoided, but I still see it sometimes. I can say the line before they say the line. Several bad guys have our hero locked in a room. They say, "We've got you now. We've locked you in this room with us." And the hero then says something to the effect of, "You think you've locked me in here with you. The fact is, you're locked in here with me." And then the hero just does the miraculous thing, which every man thinks, I could probably pull that off. No, you couldn't. Nobody could. It's a movie. It's stupid. But the idea is that, you think you've got us now. You don't realize you're in here with me. You see, Nebuchadnezzar was convinced it was his power, his might that had brought the Jews into his land, but he was wrong. Daniel 1 says God brought them into Babylon, and nothing would ever be the same again in Babylon or in Israel. Wherever you are, assume that God put you there. Improve your situation to the best of your ability. No question. Don't just sit and apathetically go with the flow like a dead fish. But do not doubt that God is in the process. Draw your lines. Where is to use a line out of Job, "Hither shalt thou come and no further." And then when you learn more, if necessary, adjust your lines. But the message we need to know here is Jesus' most often given command applied in the hearts of Daniel and his friends, and it applies in our hearts today. Fear not, for I am with you. The question is, will we obey his command, and will we believe why we should obey the command? Fear not, because he is still in the story. God has put you, in the words of Mordecai in the book of Esther, God has put you here for such a time as this. Looking forward to seeing how this unfolds in the weeks to come. May God bless you. Take the story, think about your lines, do some drawing.